We're recording this episode on the eve of Purim, and the day after Israel and the United States carried out a preemptive military strike against Iran, the land that in biblical times was known as Persia. It's a moment of tension, uncertainty, and real human consequence. On Purim, we read a phrase from the book of Esther, ve-nahafoch. Literally, it means everything was turned upside down. The day meant for destruction became a day of deliverance. The month of mourning became a month of joy. The powerless gained the upper hand. Given the headlines this week, it would be easy, perhaps even instinctive, to draw straight lines between then and now, to focus on enemies and reversals, on tides turning, on history echoing itself. But that's not where we're going. Instead, we want to ask a deeper question. What if ve-nahafoch is not simply about one side prevailing over another? What if it describes a Jewish habit of mind, the instinct to flip assumptions, to challenge the obvious, to think differently in moments of crisis? The Talmud has a phrase, ifcha mistabra, the opposite makes more sense. For Rabbinic Judaism, we will argue, ve-nahafoch became a contrarian way of thinking rather than triumphalism over victory. Since this podcast will be broadcast after Purim, we want to focus on the day after. We want to explore whether this contrarian discipline embedded in Jewish tradition might offer something we desperately need, a way of thinking that resists pride or despair, a way of responding to crisis to think different and to do it together. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform, and now on YouTube and Substack. We also publish a source sheet on Sefaria, and a link is included in the show notes. This week we celebrated Purim, and look with concern at the situation in modern-day Persia. Join us as we argue that the Purim mindset is essential to our survival as a people and as a species, and should not be limited to an annual Feast of Fools. Well, Rabbi, it's so great that you could join me on Erev Purim, but what historic times we are living in.
And it's remarkable that it's with Persia once again. So everything we talk about, like you said, we don't want to do that. We don't want to draw a line from one to the next. But you can't help but wonder as we read these stories again this year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder if one of the reasons we surprised the Iranians is maybe they expected us to attack on Purim. I know
so we got them early, right?
I know attacking during the daylight was a big part of the strategy. Maybe even Shabbat. Maybe they thought that we wouldn't attack on our Shabbat.
Well, it seems like they went after a specific meeting that was taking place.
Yep. Anyway, let's go to the text, as they say. So in Esther 9:1, it says, "And so on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened. And the Jews got their enemies in their power. ve-nahafoch. So it really, Hafuch means to turn something upside down. In Esther 9:22, it says the same thing over. We visited this the other day, the last episode when we talked about gifting, the same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month that had been transformed for them, one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. So here again it says, Nahapech lahem miyagon l'simcha me'ever liyom tov. So it wasn't enough, Rabbi, that things got better. It was precisely they got better on the day that they were going to be worse. Right. There's no question that there is, and you could say, and you could stop and say, okay, so it's narrative, irony, it is something that makes the story more compelling, it's stage drama, but we are going to argue that this word nahapech actually has a very long history in Jewish tradition, in learning, and that is what what we're going to dwell on, I want to just quote from Greenberg, who has a wonderful book called The Jewish Way, Living the Holidays. And in it, he writes, part of the dazzling paradox of Purim is the extraordinary and capricious reversal it reflects. Vashti is deposed as queen for showing modesty. Esther wins favor for the queenship because of her modesty. Mordecai in one day is raised from gallows candidate to prime minister. The very name of the holiday, Purim, meaning lottery, suggests the absurdity and vulnerability of historic events when a turn of the wheel, a night's insomnia, a moment of jealousy on the part of a drunken king spells the difference between degradation and exaltation, between genocide and survival. So again, he even kind of stretches it even further by bringing in, I think the thing that I took from it was this Purim is that it's chance also, but really this way of flipping things and taking advantage of the crisis at hand and maybe reading the data that you're given as opposed to just hitting your head against the wall and doing the same thing over and over again. What's your read?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, Greenberg, he makes it, it's all about opposites. Ve-nahafoch means that, it's the opposite. It's turned on its head. Hafuch means the opposite, right? And so here he points out about that's the whole holiday of Purim. The absurdity of Purim is that it's all about the opposite.
And I might say, and this we all know, is that God's name is not mentioned. Yes, it's the last book of Tanakh. There are those that argue that this is Greenberg's world, where we have to find the divine. The divine is hiding, so to speak, hester panim. But again, I think it gives us a little bit of a license to take some secular lessons from this, to take some practical lessons from this way of thinking. So we're going to kind of explore, as we love to do on Madlik, the word ve-nahafoch, which means to turn over. There is an iconic Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the father. It's in 522, and it says, Ben Bagbag said, turn it over, for all is there in hapech bo v'hapech bo dekulo bo. I once went to Herodian, where there was a wonderful archaeologist who spent his life digging and exploring Jewish past, and he died tragically. He fell into the pits, and they had a kind of a book there for people to write something. And I just decided that the most cool thing that I could write was ve-nahafoch bo dekulo bo, because you can also say nahafoch means to dig, and digging it for everything is in it. But the truth is, it doesn't mean so much as dig as turning over, taking that spade and turning over the soil. And I'm not sure that the interpretation that I'm kind of suggesting would be in line with the intent of the writer. I think the writer probably believed that you have to spend your life learning these texts. Even at the end, he said, never leave them. The commentaries say, don't go and study Greek philosophy, keep to the Jewish texts. But I'm taking a little bit of license in this idea of turning things upside down, looking at them from a different perspective. But it is an iconic and wonderful turn of phrase, is it not? Hapech bo v'hapech bo dekulo bo.
It's the best. It's the best, yes, and that's interesting, right? That you use that as your inscription. But that's exactly the same thing. But ve-nahafoch, right? Turn it over and turn it over. Everything is there.
So now we're going to talk about a phrase in the Talmud that I think only you always say we come from the yeshiva world, but this is a yeshiva world expression. And
That's
I
correct.
searched for it and I couldn't believe how much it conformed. Every time it is mentioned, it starts with the word matkif. And what it says is in the instance, and it's truly one of hundreds of instances in Brachot 45, it says, Rav Ashi strongly objects to this. On the contrary, the opposite is more reasonable. Matkif le Rav Ashi, adarabba, Ivcha mistabra. And that formulation is repeated over and over again in the Talmud. Matkif is translated here, strongly objects. Rabbi, I almost feel like who's ever saying this is jumping on his feet. He's in your face. I don't know what the shorish is for matkif, but there's this emphasis. It puts everything else to the power of two, and it goes adarabba. It's the opposite. Ivcha, that comes from our word hafach, the opposite. It says it twice. Opposite, mistabra is logical. And this is just a wonderful formulation. And you cannot read it without feeling the emotional impact that it has. And I think when we study the Talmud and we come to one of these things, it's hard not to smile because whoever is saying it is turning things on their head.
There's no question. Well, two things I want to say. Number one is, as we all know, that's a part of the yeshiva jargon. If somebody says something to you and you think the opposite is true, you say, Ipcha mistabra. The opposite is true. So that's a phrase. And actually, there's a Yiddish word, which is fakert, which is the Yiddish way of saying Ipcha mistabra. So it became part of the English yeshiva jargon and the Yiddish yeshiva jargon. Now, Svarya here does a really interesting thing. He doesn't say the opposite makes more sense. He says the opposite is more reasonable. That's really an interesting twist on that, right? It's more reasonable, not right. So we should consider it because it's more reasonable.
Yeah, for all listeners, you have to trust us on this one, that these words are never said leaning back in an easy chair with a pipe in your hand. You are jumping to your feet. Think of it as an Oxford debating moment. And we're going to parse each one of these words. Matkif, one who raises an objector. Attacker, assailant, is what the Klein Dictionary says. Raised an objection, assailed, attacked. So it really is pregnant with, resonates with this strong response.
Means to assail, right? The word takaf is a verb to mean to assail, right? To grab. So that's what it is. So it's a great word. You're right. And that's the same thing. It's not when you're relaxed, right? It's a hard word. I think the term we use, it's an aggressive word.
Yeah. And so the next word is adarabba, turn to the stronger side. Whence, as a dialectical term, on the contrary, we're going to see a little bit down. I actually have a memo from, or a footnote from the Hebrew Institute in Israel that breaks it down even a little bit more. So let's wait on adarabba a second. And then it says ivcha, the reverse, the opposite. And here, of course, he references hafach, the exact word that we have used to start this conversation. So here's the adarabba, which I absolutely love. Its literal meaning is upon what is greater. If you heard the word rabbah in adarabba, that's what they're focused on, as if the smaller thing had been below, and now the direction is reversed and rises above what is greater than it. I have never seen a definition, a linguistic definition, that works for my drash better than this. He literally is saying adarabba, that the smaller thing should go over the larger thing. The thing
Fantastic.
That was below should now be on top. Just fascinating how these words carry such emotional baggage. Here we get to your Yiddish. So fakert, that is Yiddish. And again, trust me, my loyal listeners, when you say fakert, or if you say punkt fakert, you are doing it in the same manner that we discussed a second ago. You are standing on your face, you are in the other person's face, and you're saying you've got it all reversed and backwards. It comes from the German verkehrt, and punkt fakert means exactly the opposite.
Right. That's right. Good. That word punkt makes it even better. Right.
So Here is the one takeaway that you are all going to remember, kind listeners. When you order a latte in Israel, do not ask for a latte, ask for a cafe hafuch, because the coffee is poured on top of the milk instead of the milk being poured on top of the coffee. The Israelis take this as you are drinking hafuch, upside down. But when Israelis argue and they say, on the contrary, they say ve-nahafoch. No, you are absolutely wrong. Ve-nahafoch. What I'm trying to say from a linguistic point of view is that these words are baked into our language of discourse. I think I've said this in the past. If Eskimos have 50 words for snow, we have 50 words for disagreement. I would say for vehement disagreement. It is baked into our logic, and that's why I think we have a license today to talk the day after, post Purim, what this ve-nahafoch modality of thinking did to the Jewish people and how it changed the way they approach crisis and life.
And now, a word from our sponsor. If there's one thing we value at Madlik Podcast, it's reading texts and talking about them. That's why I'm excited to share something I created called Voice Gift Play. It fits in the palm of your hand like a remote control and clips onto any book. It's inspired by those old school museum audio guides, but this is personal. Voice Gift Play stores up to 10 hours of audio across 999 numbered recordings. You simply enter a number to record a comment, memory, or explanation, and enter the same number to play it back. It's perfect for B'nai Mitzvah practicing their laning, capturing Grandpa's favorite tune, or recording Chad Gad Yar in a voice that matters. Go to voice.gift. That's www.voice.gift and use code Madlik for 15% off. Thanks. And now back to our podcast.
Now, let me just say about Cafe Hafuch. The reason that they call it Hafuch is because it makes it more attractive. Because, sometimes when things are upside down, they're more attractive. And that's always an interesting thing, right? Means that which is forbidden is more attractive. That which is upside down is more attractive. That which is pum fakir is also more attractive.
There is a taiva. There's a glimmer of excitement for the Jew, the heir of the Israelites, when he finds out that the opposite is the case. There is emotional content here. It was a marketing tool to sell a cup of coffee because they knew just the idea of having a cafe that is upside down would be of attractive nature.
What would be interesting is to see whether the person who made up Cafe Hafuch was actually a coffee seller.
We're going to have to do some research on that. So just to give you two other kind of insights into how this worked out in the Purim halachot and story itself, we all know in Deuteronomy, it absolutely forbids cross-dressing. A woman must not put on a man's apparel, nor a man wear woman's clothing. It's called written in stone, Rabbi. You can't get any clearer than this.
Right,
but
correct.
Lo and behold, there is a strong custom. We're now going to read back to the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch. It says the custom of wearing masks on Purim and of cross-dressing is totally permitted, says the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, because of its innocent and joyful purpose. I love the fact that it uses the word gay, joyful, but in any case, as is the wearing of shatnez. So that I hadn't even thought of, that you can break the laws of kilayim and shatnez in your costume. While some would prohibit it, the mainstream halacha is that you can break the laws on Purim. Again, I'd like to think that this is a modality of turning things upside down. A modality,
sure.
and this is a day where we explore situations where we can look at them totally different. Maybe we explore looking at gender slightly differently. Maybe it's for a day, maybe it's for Shushan Purim, 2 days, maybe it stands with us afterwards, but certainly the invitation is there to look at things differently. The last thing that I'll say that is baked into this concept of breaking the rules is with Esther herself. There's a big discussion about how Esther was able to break the law and sleep with Achashverosh. And the main commentaries say that when she says to the Jewish people before Ta'anit Esther, we're going to fast the day before Purim, she says, Ka'asher avadati, avadati. If I perish, I perish. She was talking from both a physical sense and a spiritual sense. She was saying, I am going to break the law. Until now, I was ba'ones. I was forced to live with this king. In order to save the Jewish people, I am going to do it baratzon. I'm going to do it willingly, and therefore you need to pray for me. But again, Rabbi, I think what it does is it interjects into the Purim modality a sense of sometimes you have to turn things upside down, even to the point where you have to break some laws and break some rules. Nothing is totally without an exception. There has to be an exception to every rule.
Now, that's interesting that turning it upside down even allows you to break rules, because generally speaking, the whole year, we never break rules. That's always the red line. You can do things, but you can't break any rules. But on Purim, we're allowed to break rules.
So I want to quote from Thomas Kuhn, who was the greatest philosopher of science. He wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And when you hear somebody flippantly say, oh, that's a paradigm shift, the concept of paradigm shift was brought by Thomas Kuhn. His first study was about Copernicus. How do you change the perspective of science to think in terms of the universe does not orbit around the Earth, but the Earth orbits around the sun? That is what we call a paradigm shift. It changes everything. And what he says was normal science often suppresses fundamental novelties because they are necessarily subversive of the basic commitments. To have this paradigm shift, Rabbi, sometimes you have to turn things on their head. Sometimes you have to break the existing rules. Scientific revolutions are inaugurated by a growing sense that an existing paradigm has ceased to function adequately. And finally, what he says is the transition from a paradigm in crisis to a new one from which a new tradition of normal science can emerge is far from a cumulative process. It's a disruptive process. So what made me thinking about this, Rabbi, is in ancient Persia at the time of Purim, we're talking about a crisis with a capital C. This is what they meant when they said that in the same day, in the same month that was supposed to be our destruction, we flipped it and it became our victory, so to speak. It really is describing a paradigm shift. And what Kuhn forces is sometimes you need to get to a crisis to realize that we have to think differently. We would hope that the Iranians of today would use this current crisis to think differently. We would hope that the Middle Eastern countries would say, how has this being anti-Israel actually worked out for us in the last 75, 80 years? Was this a growth strategy? Was this something that helped? But I will go even further, and I will say that we, Israelis and Jews, we're very good at strategy when it comes to wars, maybe not so good in terms of what happens to us internally. And this is a moment where we all, I think, could benefit from a ve-nahafoch mentality of seeing in a moment of crisis as a moment that we can think differently.
Yeah, that's no question. I mean, that's right. Ve-nahafoch. So you say that this Purim is a Purim, we hope, of ve-nahafoch, but in a bigger sense, a kind of a global sense of rethinking the paradigm.
Questioning the assumptions and saying, what happens if I look at this altogether differently? And the other thing that occurred to me is that there ultimately develops a consensus around the paradigm shift. So you would think that this type of thinking would separate us. You would think that if I'm in your face arguing if chomestaba pum fakert, that we then have this rift between us. You're going to start your shul, I'm going to start my shul, I'm going to be caught dead in your shul, and vice versa. But that's not how it happens, and I'm going to quote a little bit from Startup Nation. And Startup Nation is this book that kind of tries to characterize why Israeli tech has been able to create more IPOs, more patents per capita than any other country. And Dan Senior and Saul Singer make a few different projections and concepts. They go, in Israel, you call your boss by his first name, you argue with him, you shout at him, then you go out and have a beer together. Israelis have an informal way of interacting that can appear abrasive to outsiders. They interrupt each other, challenge authority, and argue loudly, but it is not personal. Rabbi, I think in Israel today, unfortunately, that is too much lacking. There
I think
is the
that's right.
argumentative part of it. There's not enough of going out for a beer afterwards.
And it is personal.
And it's become personal. And I think we have to rediscover our mojo, and we have to rediscover the smile that comes at the end of Ivcha Mestabra and Pum Fakert. Of interest, he also talks about the Israeli army, which I think has not lost its mojo. In the Israeli army, soldiers are divided into those with a Rosh Gadol, a big head, and those with a Rosh Katan, a small head. A Rosh Gadol soldier does not just follow orders, he uses judgment, take initiative, and if necessary, challenges his commander. So I think there's enough in our legacy of Talmud, there's enough in the way the IDF, when it's at its best, acts that not only permits but encourages rule breaking and independent thinking. I really do feel, and of course, in the IDF and in Israel Tech, you have this strong sense of simpatico and of social connectivity. That's as important. Anybody can break the rules and everybody can change the paradigm. But to have the beer afterwards is what we desperately need. And I'm just hoping that that can be some of the takeaway that we have from this kind of Purim thinking, and not just a sense of, oh, look, what happened in the Megillah is happening all over again, and this sense of triumphalism. Because at the end of the day, if it is going to be a new Middle East, we all have to live in it, and we all have to build what I think is a rosy kind of golden future ahead of us if we handle it properly.
That's great. So the paradigm shift is we have to be able to go out with have a beer together.
That sounds good. That sounds like a l'chaim moment. So anyway, right. I pray for the citizens of Israel who are back in their shelters. Those of you who follow know that the ballistic missiles that are being shot from Iran are getting through. There is no magic to Iron Dome and David Sling. It's a great system, but this is real war. Israelis are fearful. The Iranian people, they're celebrating, I hear in the streets at the Ayatollah's demise. but there's a lot of work ahead for them. And we all have to find the courage and the passion and the ve-nahafoch thinking, I think, to get through this moment and to take this destruction and change it into building and to a future and creativity.
Amen. We're praying all together. Happy Purim or happy post-Purim to everybody, and Shabbat Shalom. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Shabbat Shalom.